Hello, everyone. It's been a long time since I posted a new video to the channel, but I had a real good occasion this week because I'm going to be talking to one of my new friends, Avellina Balestri, who I have joining me tonight. And it's, in the business of history and historical fiction, history writing, it's very rare that I run across another person doing the same thing as what I'm doing, and also another Catholic. And I kind of ran across Avellina randomly on social media a couple months ago. And turns out we're both historical fiction writers, and we started communicating, and we've shared a lot of messages and voice messages late into the night talking about history. And so I wanted to bring Avellina on the channel to talk about one of her books and some great history. So Avellina, thanks for coming here tonight to talk with me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. This is fun because, as
Yeah,
you say, it is very rare, to try and get, people who are doing similar things with regards to kind of crossing over faith and historical fiction. So,
exactly.
we
So
we need to sort of stand together.
we are going to nerd out tonight, is what we're going to do. So uh, Avellina has a very niche interest, like field of interest for history. She specializes in, and you can correct me if this is wrong, but from my purview of your work, you're really into like Georgian and maybe like early 19th century, like Regency Georgian Regency era British history. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the way I would usually describe it is the long 18th century. So
Yeah.
that kind of generally ranges from like 1688, the Glorious Revolution, to 1815, like the Battle of Waterloo, because
Yeah.
it's often considered to be like the second Hundred Years' War
Yeah.
between England and then eventually Britain and France.
Right.
So that's sort of definitely a sphere of interest to me. I mean, they also call it the Age of Horse and Musket. So, and that can kind of lean, even a little further back. You get the English Civil Wars and stuff like that. But
And this
but
this
yeah,
encompasses, of course, the American Revolution. And one thing that got me really interested in your work is your focus on the American Revolution from the British perspective. And this is something I've actually lectured on in the past. And I'm fascinated by this subject as well. So when I saw that you were interested in that, I guess that's what really piqued my interest. And one of the things we're going to be talking about on this interview is you've got a new book out. It's actually part of a trilogy called All Ye That Pass By. Volume one is Gone for a Soldier, which I've been reading, and this is we'll talk more about it, but this takes place during the American Revolution, and the protagonist is a British chap, which is interesting because normally as an American, when we're reading Revolutionary War fiction, it's always going to be from the colonists' side. But before we get into that, just like how did you're Avellina Balestri, you're Italian as they get. How did you get so interested? How did you become such an Anglophile at this particular era in history?
well, in terms of becoming an Anglophile, it was actually through Robin Hood. So
Oh,
when I was a kid, the Robin Hood bug just bit me, and I got really, really into it. Not just the sort of, film and TV end of it. I mean, I grew up watching the Disney cartoon and the Richard
right.
Green series and the Errol Flynn movie. And, it just was one of those things that was very, very formative to me growing up. And I just loved it. It was my favorite story. And so with time, as I grew older, I just became fascinated with the entire like historical background of Robin Hood and how
Yeah.
the legends evolved and all of the different ways in which the story manifested itself and the elements of myth and legend and history, and it's just endless with it. So that was really my first love, was grounded in the Middle Ages, and English and wider British Isles history in the Middle Ages and the
Hmm.
Crusades and everything like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that was also the whole like era of the Norman conquest and the aftermath, which plays a massive role in my first novel that I actually released, which is part of another series that's in still in the works, The Telling of the Beads. And that first volume, Saplings of Sherwood, basically deals a lot with the historical background of the aftermath of the Norman conquest.
Yeah.
So all that fascinated me. So there's that is the whole King Arthur and the Arthurian cycles
Sure.
and sort of myth, legend, folklore, that kind of thing was the first thing that really got me into British stuff. And the Catholic elements too that you find within that, within Robin Hood, within King
Sure.
Arthur. And then really, I would say the next stepping stone in terms of Anglophilia would be the English martyrs.
Right.
So the 40 martyrs of England and Wales and et cetera, because there was others as well who didn't make it into that 40 count. But I was always just absolutely invested in the stories of St. Thomas More, Edmund Campion,
Yeah.
Margaret Clitheroe, Margaret Ward. Margaret Ward is my confirmation saint.
Oh, great.
So that was a big part of what got me interested. And then 18th century in particular, and sort of the long 18th century. I suppose that just kind of came organically as well. I mean, it was like the little things when I was a child that obviously overlaid with it. Like, for
Yeah.
example, growing up with American Girl, with regards to Felicity, was always my
Yeah. Yeah.
favorite. She was the
Felicity.
doll. Yeah, she was the doll I got. I feel like I should have gotten and still have the doll. So I should have.
Yeah.
I feel like I should have brought her as a presentation item. But yeah, she was the one I was really interested in, and Liberty's Kids I
Yeah.
watched growing up. And I used to watch it, interestingly enough, at my grandmother's house. This is my memory of it, in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which has quite a bit of Revolutionary War history. And my dad
Right.
would take me up to the Fort Lee bluffs overlooking the Hudson River. And so this was part of my upbringing, too, with the American Revolution. Because I was already so interested in British history and legend and folklore as a kid, it was almost natural for me to come at the American Revolution, with all
Yeah.
of this in mind and thinking of it through a kind of, Anglosphere lens, I suppose. So I'm viewing like the American colonies as being British in my head.
Right. Because
It's
you're already kind of coming at this whole history from a British perspective, and it's natural that you're going to look at the American Revolution from that perspective as
right.
well.
It was
Um,
organic to me to do that, because that's like where the history actually originated. So it's just kind of like, oh, well, you naturally come at it from the point of these are British colonists.
yeah.
So,
It's a
there's
very
the
interesting century, especially the latter part of the long 18th century, as you say, because there's still a lot of like leftovers and baggage from the Reformation era and the era of
Mhm,
the Glorious Revolution. They're still very much in touch with the events and the politics of the 1680s and the religious settlement, but things have also started to calm down. There's more enlightened voices that are prevailing on the religious question, like George III himself, who was the most tolerant English king of Catholics to that time. There was your
mhm,
first initial calls for Catholic emancipation. You start to see Britain transitioning into how we're going to recognize it in the 19th century and like the heyday of the British Empire. So it's an interesting
mhm,
like transitionary period, and that really comes out in your novel as well, where there's there's lots of talk and references to the Glorious Revolution or even the Stuarts and things like that. And it's just interesting how all these different historical threads are kind of at play at that time.
yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It is a very interesting transitionary period, and I would even actually go further to say that in addition to having these strong influences from the previous century,
Hmm.
previous centuries, really, of like the very earliest modern period of
Yeah.
the 16th and 17th centuries that are influencing the 18th century, I would even go further as to say that there's still a stronger sense of in touchness, I suppose, with the medieval past. Even though
Yeah.
there's all these shifts happening, there's still something there, which almost, if you will, that the phantom of medieval England is
Yeah.
still is still there. I mean, I always think about the Gorgets, and this becomes, as you've probably noticed in the story, or at least maybe part of the stuff that you read, where I have to think in my head. It's one of those things when you write. I'm sure you experience this. You
Yeah.
write a book, you edit the thing this way and that. You don't quite know where something is in it,
No, I
but
know.
it becomes a quite a point. The focusing on the main character, Edmund Southworth, Ned's heritage, which goes back to the Middle Ages, and
Yep.
touching upon that is very important to his whole self understanding. But even his self understanding, ultimately, of the role he takes up, and the officer's gorget being the last piece of chivalric armor,
Hmm.
and there's all this symbolism and this
Is that
sense.
those of us who don't know, because I don't know what the gorget is that the little thing that they wear on their, like the
The
little piece of?
crescent. Yeah, the
Yes.
crescent, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, that you would wear around your neck, and it
I'll
and
put a
it's
picture of
symbol.
it right here. There we go.
Okay, excellent. And that, would usually have something to indicate the sovereign.
Yep.
So it would either be the lion and the unicorn, or Georgius Rex, GR, something like that. Or it would symbolize, again, like what branch of service
Yeah.
you were with. So the Marines had a really interesting one, for example, which would incorporate the anchor because they were the sea soldiers. I do reference that when we meet Major John Pitcairn of the Marines.
This
Um,
is this is something I wanted to point out in reading this book, and we'll transition and talking to the book here. But first, as you guys can see, Avellina's knowledge on all the historical minutia and details of this period is extremely impressive and broad, and it comes across so much in the writing. When I was reading this, I was just very impressed by the level of detail. I mean, I'm not an expert in this era by any means, but I could see, like, not just in the things you reference, like that, the gorget, but like in the vocabulary. Like, this book is like reading something written in this time period. Like when you read Jane Austen or something, and it's clearly the way the people speak in that time period. Like, you studied and had knowledge of the mannerisms of speech, like the social customs. A lot of times when I read historical fiction, uh, like when I was a kid, there was this show I used to watch, the Legendary Adventures of Hercules with Kevin Sorbo,
Mhm.
and I remember watching him like fighting the Hydra, and they're trying to figure out how to kill the Hydra, because when you cut off its heads, more grow back.
Right.
And Hercules says, "We need to find a way to short circuit this thing." And I was like,
Like,
short circuit? Like, do you know what century you live in?
oh Lord.
And often when I read historical fiction, you run across like modernisms like that, where people say things where I'm
Mhm.
like, that's not a word in this 17, but like, I was paying attention for it, and you don't have any of that. Like the way your characters speak, the way they conduct themselves, the language you use, it's so historically tailored to this period, and so I want to commend you for that. But um, let's
Thank
talk.
you. I
Let's.
really appreciate that.
You're very welcome. Let's talk about the book, though. So the book centers on a protagonist, Edmund Ned Southward, and he is a. It's really about. Well, there's a lot of themes, but he's a. How do you say the word? Recusant? Recusant?
Requisite.
Recusant?
Requisite, yeah.
What? Tell us what that is.
So a recusant is someone who refuses, that's literally what the word means,
Yep.
to take the various oaths and acts that were passed of allegiance to the Church of England, swearing to basically the king's claim to be head or governor of the church in England.
Right. Right.
And so it starts, with the oath of supremacy under Henry VIII. That's the
Hmm.
beginning of these things. And
Yep.
then down through the centuries after that, they take all forms. But they have the same theme. They're trying to get people to swear to this claim.
There's a way to
Um,
keep Catholics out of influential positions.
Absolutely, yeah. So as we touch upon in the book, Ned cannot participate in the military
Right.
when he is a Catholic, when he's a recusant. But in addition to that, there's so many things he can't do. Like, for example, going to
The
universities like
university.
Oxford
Yep.
and Cambridge, voting, for heaven's sakes. Certainly can't run for politics. I mean, he can't vote. And various other things, ranging from not being allowed to own weaponry like firearms and swords, and in some cases not being allowed to own horses.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're basically being cut off of, and this is the case with Ned, comes from a noble family
Hmm.
that have fallen on very hard times because of all the tithes and taxes that are being leveled on Catholics.
Yeah.
And so he's cut off from his fellow people of that class because he can't participate in these things that would normally be open to them. So
Right.
for example, when it comes to riding, he can't do riding because he doesn't have a horse. So he has to walk everywhere, and that is like a humiliation for a noble to be doing that. He can't go hunting, which is a massive aspect of noble culture or upper class culture in this universe. And there's just so many different fencing, so many different things. And he does ultimately end up having Anglican friends who let him do stuff on the slide,
Sure.
which is
Sure.
a yeah, but at the same time, it's not supposed to be. Heck, they're not even supposed to own land. They really
Yeah.
aren't. Like on the books, they shouldn't be. But what was common in this time period is if it was an old family and they were well thought of in the area, the
People
local
left, kind of
members
left them alone.
kind of left him be. Yeah, they
Yeah.
didn't, it was one of those things where, but here's the important point. On a dime, things could change.
Yeah.
So they might leave you be for decades and not really cause you much trouble and just leave you to your own. But then if something happened, something shifted in the mood of the nation, usually because of fighting with France or Spain or something,
Yeah.
suddenly your whole position, the rug could be pulled out from under you and you lose everything.
Yeah.
So they always have to live like this
Yeah.
fear of losing everything.
And
Um,
you really make that come through in the character of Ned's mother, who is
mhm.
Ned's mother is like Ned is very. So Ned's a recusant. He kind of wants to go out and stretch his legs and get into the world a bit. He's going to wind up mixed up in the events, the British involvement in campaigns of the American Revolution. He has friends from different confessions. His mother is more like, you can never trust a Protestant, and
Yeah.
Ned's like, oh, but they wouldn't do that to us, and she's like, on, like you said, on a dime they could turn us in for this or that or get us in trouble, and it really reflects that tension that Catholic recusant families must have dealt with.
Oh, absolutely. And I tried my best in depicting this family to be as realistic as I could.
Mm,
From what we know of the real experiences of people. And so the background story of Perpetua, I'm not sure if you read that section or not, but basically when she talks about her backstory of a mob having attacked her house and her father being basically crippled and then being kicked
yeah,
out of their house, and then her and her siblings being taken away from their parents. This stuff really happened.
yeah.
And then they would be forced raised Protestant, basically. And we touch upon it with several other characters as well that this happens to in the course of the trilogy. So it was a real concern.
So Ned will he runs in with General Burgoyne. We'll talk about Burgoyne a little bit, so let's not talk about him right now. But
He does. He
he
takes over, doesn't he?
he does. He's a big personality, but
He is.
let's just, like, Ned ends up getting involved with the military, and what keeps him out of an officer's commission, what one of the specific penal laws that keeps coming up in your book is the Test Act in
Mhm.
particular. Can you tell us what the Test Act was specifically, what it was meant to do, what a person had to swear to for the Test Act?
Sure. So the Test Act was essentially a latter-day oath of supremacy. That's
Hmm.
basically what it was, where you would be swearing to the king's title as, heads or governor of the church in England. Depending on the time period, those titles shifted a little bit, but the point is, it's the same basic premise when you get down to it.
Yeah.
And that you would be there for repudiating any allegiance to the Pope, or
Mhm.
the Catholic Church or the bishops of the Holy See, but they went further than that. They were very, very specific in the way they were trying to target Catholics. And this is why, see,
Yeah, didn't you
yes,
have to specifically say that the mass was idolatrous
yes,
and deny transubstantiation?
exactly, you had to deny transubstantiation. And you also had to deny the communion of saints in various
Mm,
forms
yeah,
of this act. And the Virgin Mary, devotion to the Virgin Mary. So it
right.
was very, very
Very
insidious.
targeted. Yeah,
Very, very sorry. And this is actually something that again comes up in the story is that there are other dissenting Protestants who have a hard time with the issue of the king's title. They
sure.
really do. We run into this with regards to Major John Pitcairn brings it up. I don't know if you read that part where the
Let's not give
conversation.
away specifics.
Okay,
Yeah.
won't give away specifics, but suffice to say, he comes from a Covenanter Presbyterian
Yeah,
background.
there's a whole class of people known as separatists that also
Oh yeah,
contest the English or the
the
Anglican
Puritans,
claims. Yeah.
the Puritans and the Separatists had their own thing going, and then you had the Presbyterians and the Covenanters in Scotland, and they were doing their own thing.
Which were,
And
I
then
think
later,
these all were called just nonconformists.
yes, and they could be called recusants as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So they fell under that title because they were refusing too.
Right. But they weren't
So
as socially detested as the Catholics.
oh, nowhere near it. And furthermore, many of them knew it was sort of like this would be what would be told to them when they were like being presented. And this is why I brought up Pitcairn in particular,
Yeah.
because within the sequence we have Gage, General Thomas Gage asks him, "So what do you consider yourself to be now, Presbyterian or Anglican? Because you attend both services. You've taken the Test Act, obviously,
Yeah.
but you're the son of a Presbyterian moderator, a Presbyterian cleric. You're literally, were raised, within the manse building next to well, what used to be a Catholic church, but became a
Yeah.
Presbyterian church. So what are you?" And he's kind of like, I'm a damn Protestant. That should be good enough. And so there was
Right.
this notion that was being pitched that, hey, look, you guys, this is really just to keep the papists out.
Right. We
Yeah,
all know
we
what this
know,
is. Yeah.
we all know what this is doing. Come on, guys, you know, the king has at this point in time, and this is like post Glorious Revolution,
Hmm.
he's done a kind of a deal. He kind of deal with you guys. So
Yeah.
yeah, he says he's governor of the church in England, but look, he's a member of the Kirk in Scotland. So come on, he can do it. You can do it. We're all Protestants here. Let's,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
that is how oftentimes they would justify taking the act and sort of be like, all right, you know what? The most important thing is that we're all in this sort of porridge together and keep the papists out. So that was
Yeah.
definitely in play there.
So basically, as long as Ned or any character, any person in his situation, their difficulties could their whole state in life could drastically change if they would just take the Test Act, because that's
Mm,
functionally how you demonstrated that you were a good Englishman, an Anglican,
absolutely.
and then you could go to university, you could get an officer's commission, you could advance. I think now I don't know if this was in force in England, but in the Irish penal laws, it was particularly awful where they said that you couldn't they made it even difficult to inherit or to pass down
Same,
wealth, and then they had a
same,
law where if one of your children went Protestant, he got all of it, and it was a way
same,
to like break up the wealth of Catholic families. But so
same.
this wasn't just some this Test Act wasn't just some kind of like meaningless thing that was a mere formality. It could
Oh yeah.
drastically change, like make or break you depending on where you were standing with it.
Yeah, so everything you just said regarding the Irish Acts is the same in England.
Was it? Okay.
So the only thing that was slightly different was I would just say not in terms of what was written down, but rather in terms of practice in this
How it
case.
was enforced,
So
yeah.
how it was enforced, and it wildly depended. Now, Ned comes from Lancashire. It was the county with the most recusant Catholics.
Yep.
So there was an understanding, and this comes up in the book as well. They didn't want sectarian violence.
Right.
They wanted to try to deal with this sizable minority of Catholics in a manner that didn't break out into, again, kind of civil war kind of stuff.
Yep.
So they kind of knew that to a certain extent it would be advantageous to them, the powers that be, to kind of turn a blind eye,
Yeah.
at least a lot of the time. But again, could change on a dime. But
Right.
but there was this understanding. So Ned, well, what we show in the story is that Ned really does think he's going to have issues with regards to inheriting the ancestral home. That he's going
Yeah.
to have
He
issues
can
with
see,
regards.
yeah, he can see how this will affect him, and Ned will struggle with this and with the Test Act. You'll have to read the book to see how it pans out
Yeah.
for Ned. But so before we get to Burgoyne, and I've got a bunch on him, but one thing I really liked about the book is you have a scene where Ned's like in London, like before he's going to the colonies, and there's some scenes with Parliament, and he's meeting different parliamentarians. and you really dug into the politics of the age. You see the Whigs, and I don't know if you'd call them the Tories back then,
Yes, you would.
but you see this era in history. Of course, people trace the parties in England back a little bit earlier to the Glorious Revolution period, but it's really in the 1700s that they start to emerge as distinct, real like parties in the modern sense, with like like Fox and William Pitt and these different people who would argue. And I thought this was particularly great because as an American, when you learn about the American Revolution, Britain is just presented as very monolithic, as
Hmm.
like the British wanted to tax us and they wanted to do this and this and this.
Hmm.
And the truth is that's simply not the case. The American Revolution was hotly debated in the British Parliament, and there was people in the Parliament who supported independence. They even, I can't remember the names of them, but there was a movement where some of them would come to Parliament with blue sashes on to demonstrate solidarity with the Continental Army. And you see in your book, you
Yeah,
have
they
debate.
were kind of the extreme. Yeah, they were
What's
kind of the
up?
extreme.
Yeah,
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 they were kind of the extreme, like, fringe of the Whigs, in
yeah,
the
yeah.
sense that, like, they were really the rad Whigs, you might say.
But it really it,
Who were
it really shows that the American Revolution, I'm sure this is a bad example, but like in our own history, the Vietnam War, how it was hotly debated and contested in the States, where there was people for, against, all sorts of middle ground. And you really kind of draw that out and get into the politics of it. But why don't you, if you can briefly summarize, like most of us, many of my well, not my students, because I teach them more of the accurate history, but many American students don't realize that opinions in Britain were so divided on the war. Can you give a rundown of like some of the majority different opinions in Britain on the American Revolution?
Sure. So I mean, there's a lot. It would be impossible to really
Well, I
cover
said
it. And,
briefly and
yeah,
major.
briefly. There we go. You just gave me two very difficult things to achieve.
Okay. Sorry.
Um, so I mean, in brief, I suppose the ones that manifest in the book, in terms of
Yeah.
what I cover, is sort of the majority Whig and Tory viewpoints. And obviously, though, there were people within the Whigs and Tories parties that had very different views from each other, right? Even
Hmm.
within the parties.
Yeah.
Um, but generally speaking, you had two major camps. The one camp was, more conservative and was essentially just like, hey, we have the right to directly tax our colonies. This has been something that is accepted by all of really the major powers of Europe when it comes to colonies. We can directly tax if it
Sure.
comes down to it. Now there were difficulties with this due to, I think, just changes within the British sort of system that came as a result of the aftermath of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, where you had the king holding a position of primacy,
Yeah.
which shifted to the supremacy of Parliament. So now you have, like, where the king used to be the undisputably top dog, and now it's like, well, he still kind of is, but yeah, at the other hand, it's Parliament that they're saying the supremacy of Parliament. It's gotten more complicated, to say the very least. So now you have this representative body that is sort of taking prerogative that once was the king's. So the king used to be, okay, I can directly do this, but then you had all the English Civil War stuff and Glorious
Yeah.
Revolution, and that has been challenged. So now it's complicated, and so that makes, I think, the position difficult. Where on the one hand they're like, hey, we have the default right to directly tax the colonies. That's kind of a kingly prerogative.
Yeah.
But now they're a representative body. But then the whole question is, okay, then if you're a representative body, how do you like do that exactly if you've not representing the places you're taxing? Somehow with the king, it was more like a consistent argument, kind of, if
Yeah.
that makes
Yeah.
it was like the king has the right to tax across the board if he wants. I mean, yeah, sure. I'm not saying
I
he
think
would
what you're
do it.
saying is when you're dealing with the sovereignty of the king, the issue of representation isn't an issue because that doesn't factor into the king's supremacy,
Exactly.
but it does factor into an elected body.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not trying to say that even prior to, like, the English Civil War, kings didn't have to work with people, because it's kind of a misnomer.
Sure, sure,
People
sure.
had this notion that kings just did their own thing. They did no,
No, they
they
were
never
sharply
did.
limited.
Absolutely, absolutely. Throughout, any point in the Middle Ages you look at, kings couldn't just do whatever the king wanted. It didn't work like that. And so there's all of that. There's a lot of nuance, but the point being simply saying that the conservatives were of a mind that, hey, whatever the top brass entity is in Britain, it has the right to tax its colonies. And these taxes are fair. They're literally war taxes and they're taxes for defense. This is not, this is not being unreasonable here. And so they would just simply come down on that side of it and say, the colonists are being ridiculous. Frankly, they're being over the top. They're being
Yeah,
dramatic.
just stick to the course, make them pay, and
Stick to the course, make them pay. Don't look like you're kind of waffling all over the place.
yeah,
And
and they argued for even the issue of representation. They argued for something called virtual representation, which was this idea like, look, you people in Virginia and Carolina, you're not voting for members of parliament, but that doesn't really matter because parliament, uh, even though you have individual members elected from all around, when they come together, parliament governs the affairs of the entire British Empire, including
Mhm.
the colonies, and we are representing you in a virtual sense, even though you don't vote.
And I think that that's actually fair, to be
I think
honest.
it is too, honestly.
I'm honestly, this is so funny because people have come to me in terms of my writing, and they'll say, "Oh, you must be like a Whig sympathizer the way you've written the Whigs." And I'm sort of like, actually, I lean more conservative. I actually understand the Whig perspective, and I actually can see both. I
Yeah.
really can. I can see any perspective and sympathize with any perspective short of taking up arms against the king. I'll be honest. I think that is where I cut off.
Well,
So
it's easy to tell. I figured out where your sympathies are when we started talking about George III, and it became clear you're a huge George III fanboy. Yeah.
I'm a fangirl,
So
absolutely.
you have
Oh, so that was one. Oh, so sorry. I realized I didn't even shift over to the Whigs. So the Whigs
oh yeah, go
have a
ahead.
totally different viewpoint on this, where the Whigs really felt like it was unfair. Not all of them, by the way, but just the same majority opinion. That they felt that it was actually something that they needed to do better on imperially, that they
Yeah,
needed to do better representatively. Now, this is an interesting point too. Representation was even sketchy within Britain. So
sure.
there was a lot of stuff going on. It wasn't just this like attack against the colonies. And this was very different, for example, even manifested in different colonies that Britain had, such as in Canada, a whole different situation, as with the Sugar Islands. It was all very complicated. It wasn't just like, oh, it's just this
Yeah,
attack.
you found this argument among the conservatives, and I can't remember which one said this, but like when the colonists were protesting they couldn't vote, this
Mhm.
guy said something like 90% of people in England can't vote. What's your point?
What's your point? I thought I feel the same way about Canada and the Sugar Islands too, because they had different setups
Yeah.
as well. It was just kind of like, okay, I understand. This is where I would come in on the Whigs and say, I understand some people who were like, okay, that may have been the status quo, but maybe we could do like better. And there was different ideas to that. So people, for example, would argue, well, we can give the colonists representation in parliament, but then the conservatives would even say back, yeah, okay, but they wouldn't even be properly represented per head, per capita. There'd be all kinds of issues. In other
Yeah.
words, with figuring out how to proportionally represent. It was
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah, it
Even
was very
it was
complicated.
very complicated, and if you just let the Burgesses do their own thing entirely, that sounded like a mess. I
Yeah.
completely understand why people were kind of like, that sounds crazy. Like that just sounds like this chaos is going to happen. Like,
Yeah.
and so like it was actually like a legit like what, this just sounds really confusing. Better just make them pay. Um, and
And
so
you find certain Whigs too that took what I would say was a very pragmatic, like you had some that were very idealist about it.
yeah,
And then you had some who were pragmatic where they're like doing the math and they're saying like the amount of money we spend like sending troops here, like doing all this stuff, like it actually is not paying itself off. Like we would make more money if we just let them be independent. They have to like what if they had to guard the frontiers and they had to do all that stuff and we could just reap the benefits of trade. And I think Edmund Burke was of that opinion, where they're
now
just looking at it monetarily and saying like we could make a lot more money off of this if we just let them go and then just traded with them.
Well, you see, there's pros and cons to that as well. Now, first of all, I would say that the one way in which that was being presented was not so much letting them be entirely independent, like that came much later.
More like a Dominion proto
There we
Dominion
go. Yeah,
idea.
more. more of a dominion argument, because there was people who were arguing for, and this is something that you see throughout British imperial history,
Yeah.
the idea of an imperial parliament, which I always found interesting.
Mm.
I always found it interesting because they were saying, yeah, putting it into the like British Parliament could get confusing. That's what everybody was worried about, and
Yeah.
ultimately all whacked out. What if we did an imperial parliament where somehow we represented, the different aspects of the empire in this other way, something new? But that
Yeah.
also, I mean, I would have
That's
been
what the
very
German Empire had.
fascinated. Right, I would be very fascinated to see how that turned out. And not gonna lie, I'm still holding out for the reunification of the Anglosphere
Why
someday.
don't you write an alternate history where they make an imperial parliament and the empire stays together into
Well,
the 21st century?
exactly. Well, yeah, that's sort of exactly my thought on it, because I'm sort of like, I think that would have been cool. I think it would have had its own problems, tons of
Sure.
them potentially, but still, I think it would have been. I think it could have been done.
Would
I
have been
think
cool.
it would have been cool. So that was another thing you had some Whigs bring up. So the point is, yes, you are completely correct. British opinion, just like colonial opinion, was
Yeah.
extremely, extremely mixed. And as you
But
say, there was pragmatic, the thing with some of the Whigs toward the
yeah.
end, toward the end, when they
Yeah,
saw they
once the war had already happened and they were already paying hand over foot for the war, and
they
you
were
see,
losing.
yeah,
They were losing. That was the thing, that was becoming a situation where it was A, becoming a bloodbath.
yeah,
B, you were bleeding money, and then you get all of these other countries jumping in like vultures for the
yeah,
dying animal.
yeah,
That was what was generating these. Hey, it would be better if you just let them
cut our
go.
losses.
Yeah.
I want to make a statement and see if you agree with it or not. I was thinking about this, and it seems like the meta issue with the colonies was that the colonies were originally set up on a very kind of like ad hoc basis without a lot of forethought. Kind of like, okay, we're going to go to Virginia to find some crops to make some money. Oh,
Yes.
sure. Lord Baltimore, you were friends with my dad. Here's some land.
Yeah.
Sure, William Penn, you can go. Oh, sure, we can shove some convicts in Georgia. So it's kind of like this ad hoc thing, a lot of it under royal prerogative in the
Hmm.
1600s, with no forethought to set up the administrative or bureaucratic machinery to manage them in the
Hmm.
future, because it's almost like when they were setting up the colonies, they didn't imagine that they would become home to 2 million people. And
Yes.
so when they start to get to the point in the after the French and Indian War, when they're like, we really need to integrate these colonies into our financial system, the bureaucracy, or even their political system, the bureaucracy for it simply didn't exist. And they're
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to do it. But by this time, the colonies have existed for, 2 centuries without that stuff. And it's bound to cause a lot of problems.
Well, that is, I completely agree. That there was this kind of just, flying by the seat of the pants vibe with
Slipshod.
regards, yeah, with regards to setting up the colonies, because it was a race to kind of, oh, new world, we could do things, woo! And
Or
it was like,
think about how they got New York just like randomly, like, let's just sail up to New Amsterdam and see if we can take it.
yes,
Like not a lot of forethought.
no, there wasn't. It was just sort of, I think all of the European powers that got involved in that kind of stuff were doing
Yeah.
that. And it was just kind of like a little run for, hey, like, let's try and get some stuff. And it's like,
Yeah.
did you guys thinking this out? And then and then down the line, yeah, things happen, and it's sort of like it grows, it becomes a real thing that is important, I think, to, certainly in the case of Britain, what Britain even is. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think this is something that we tend to forget as well, that in as much as the Americans saw themselves as British, well, the British overseas empire went into how Britain saw themselves. So
Right.
losing that, and this is something why I think losing that was an irreparable damage. No amount of trading money could fix. No
Right.
amount. And it was something I don't even think all of these like Eastern adventures could fix. The loss of America, it was something that was feared, dreaded, and very, very, it was something that was going to break the trajectory of where Britain was going and
Right.
create a rival. And they dreaded this. And I quoted directly in the section you were talking about in Parliament and everything. I am very, as you mentioned, why a lot of the dialogue sounds so 18th century is because I draw heavily
Yeah.
from the documentation. I draw heavily from letters and speeches and diaries and you name it. I basically try and adapt it and put it in as best I can to convey these ideas. And people were scared with very good reason that if the empire broke apart, it would come back to bite Britain.
Yeah,
Maybe not
and that's
immediately, but it would.
and it was very like you see in history they often will speak of two British empires, the first British Empire and the second British
Mhm.
Empire. The first one is in the Americas, and the second one is like the reconstitution of the British Empire in the Victorian era. I'm sure there's
And
more
it was never
con.
the same because it wasn't the Anglosphere, really. See, the
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Anglosphere was something they
yeah. It's
owned
more
children. There was this
right.
America was the child. It was not simply conquered lands. This was something
Exactly.
very
And
specific.
I think you that was so interesting what you just said about how it affects the way Britons view themselves. I'm thinking about the issue in the lead up to the War of 1812
Mhm.
with the issue of impressment of sailors, where the British Navy was arguing that no British subject could renounce his allegiance. So if you were caught as an American on the high seas, you were treated as a British subject and could be impressed.
Yeah.
And I've always found that, first of all, I can see why the Americans took such umbrage at that because it's denying our country the right to naturalize citizens. But it really speaks to how the British psyche in the generation after the Revolution was perceiving Americans, like kind of like they're still actually, like kind of like haven't really let them go yet. You're still
They're
actually
like
British.
fallen away Catholics.
Yeah, they're falling away Britons.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Burgoyne. Burgoyne is, you have so many historical characters in the book. Um, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne shows up
Mm.
at the beginning. He's like the inciting incident that will take Ned away from his historic homestead and take him out into the wide world. He's a bombastic character. He's larger than life, and he's going to the action of the book. At least in the second part of the book, really centers around Burgoyne's the campaign of Burgoyne's march leading to Saratoga. Can you tell us about what Burgoyne was trying to do, maybe the Saratoga campaign, just a little bit about him and this military venture?
Yeah. So should I start with Burgoyne as a person or the campaign, or how do you want me to do this?
Um, we'll talk about Burgoyne as a person. Talk about the
Okay, so first
campaign first.
campaign.
Yep.
Okay. So basically, the idea of the campaign was to have a British force march south from Canada
Hmm.
down to Albany and then have another British force march up from New York City to meet that force in Albany. And then have another force coming in from the west, and it was like going to be this sort of triune kind of
To kind of cut the New
crossover.
England colonies off from the middle colonies.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
especially, cutting off the Hudson River.
Right.
So this was the idea behind it, and this was supposed to, end the rebellion. That was the logic. It was a very bold plan, full of Murphy's Law,
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
anybody looking at this thing, frankly, I mean, even when I was writing it, I kind of felt like jumping in the story at some point and being like, yo, dude, I
Like
don't
watching a
know
horror
about
movie.
this.
Don't go in there.
Yeah, yeah, I just don't feel I'm not feeling good vibes, my man. Don't. So yeah, that was happening when I was writing it. And so, they have that meme about, girls go back in a time machine, boys go back in a time machine. I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm the one in the time machine who's just like, Johnny, listen to me. But
Yeah.
so so yeah, that was the plan. Everything kind of that could have gone wrong went wrong with the campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, ranging from just the mere territorial situation. I mean, you're going through huge tracts of mostly uncharted wilderness. I mean, Johnny,
He
he
fell
seems
prey
to
to
think,
he fell prey to not realizing how big New York State is.
oh, he didn't. He didn't. He thought it was going to be a walk in the park. He acted like it, and he advertised like it. And
Yeah.
it was just kind of like, you don't, man, you just don't, and you don't get it. And he didn't have it realizing, and he really overestimated the amount of help he was going to get, both from loyalists and from Indians, because the thing is, the Indian situation completely backfired,
Hmm.
in terms of he
You
was
delve into
really,
that in the book, I noticed.
yes, he thinks he's going to be able to control this situation.
Yeah.
He really does. And he's adorable. He gives them this Anglican Sunday school lesson about his consciousness of Christianity. It's so cute. And it's
Yeah.
also like, dude, what are you doing?
It doesn't
And
impress the Iroquois.
yeah, they don't care, man. They really don't. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that whole thing was yeah,
Now,
that was amazing.
forgive my ignorance on, like I said, this isn't my special area of history, but is this the campaign that kind of leads or culminates at the taking of Fort Ticonderoga?
Um, so Ticonderoga was actually taken by the British.
Okay.
So we're talking about Ticonderoga that came in and out of many hands many times.
Okay. Okay.
But you are right that Ticonderoga is taken on this campaign
Yeah.
by the British, and actually, it's one of the things that makes General William Phillips, who appears in this story, our favorite Welshman,
Yeah.
he makes him famous because he was the head of the British artillery under Burgoyne,
Yeah.
and he's the one who figures out how to drag the guns up a height.
Right.
And he's the one who manages to take Ticonderoga back for the British, and he famously says, where a goat can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, he can drag a gun. And so he manages to get his guns up there, and it becomes Philip's big moment. And then
Yeah. Yeah.
our wonderful Highlander General Simon Fraser, in the aftermath of this, gets his blood up and decides, I'm going to pursue the fleeing, rebels from the fort, the fleeing rebels who they evacuate the fort. And this kind of goes wrong. And you end up
Oh
where he
yeah.
gets drawn into this massive skirmish situation that was quite costly and bloody, for his
Yeah.
advanced guard. So yeah, you get some wonderfully colorful characters. I
Yeah.
really
The
love.
whole thing falls apart, and I was, the way you wrote Burgoyne the man,
Mhm.
it's hard to explain. You have to read the book, but he's very colorful. And first of all, from an author perspective, I appreciate that because I read a lot of books where characters are bland, one dimensional.
Mhm.
Burgoyne was so colorful, and
He
I could
really is.
instantly sense the kind of man he was by reading your depiction of him. He's called Gentleman Johnny, and he has an air of sophistication. He knows how to be deferential. He knows how to follow social convention, but he's also like a libertine at the same time. It's kind of like he has a veneer of gentlemanliness, but he's kind of like, there's all these hints about his sordid things going on the side, and like he drinks too much, or he will get other people to drink too much to get them to do things, and he has, he's a
Card sharp. Card sharp.
yeah, card shark. He's kind of brash. So it's an interesting. It's kind of like you get the sense that it's this guy who is kind of like forcing himself to fit into the conventions required of him by his rank. But if he didn't have to do that, he would be doing a lot of different things. So he's very well written, but it made me interesting to read about him in real life. So I started studying a little. I read some websites for about 20 minutes,
Mhm.
studying, but and I think they were, I don't know, it seemed like they were very American centric because Burgoyne is a very important, like basically from the American point of view, Burgoyne is like the Cornwallis of the Northern Theater. He's
Mhm.
like the British general who comes over and he's pompous, and then he messes it all up, and the colonials have a victory at his expense. And haha, doesn't
Mhm.
he look so like another
Oh,
arrogant
yeah.
British gentleman, like blah blah, these colonials. Blah.
He
And
gets
that's the way
reduced
he
to
was
that.
presented, and it was kind of like, yeah, he was arrogant, he was cocky, he was stupid, and like, is that accurate, or do you think he was much more like, does he deserve does he deserve a second look in how he was?
Oh yeah, well, this is something that I've always like, I've always been a Burgoyne kind of fan since he's been one of my favorite British generals
Yeah.
of the war, my favorite generals in general of all time.
Yeah.
In terms of, as you say, he was just this very colorful, nuanced character,
Mhm.
many layers to the man.
Yeah, yeah.
He was a playwright, a poet, an artist. He loved classic literature. He loved history. He
Hey,
was
he's a
very,
literary figure in his own right.
oh yes, oh
Yeah.
yes. And he said the thing is, this was something that I gravitated to him for as I was doing more and more research on him, and as I was doing more and more of the writing process. I found myself bleeding into him. It was one of those things because I think we're both ENFP. Really the campaigner, and so this for me, like, I relate to a lot of aspects of him. I mean, not the libertine part or the card shark part or the
Sure.
drinking and carousing and brothels part, but the the part that had this idealism, because he had idealism,
Yeah.
and that it had this artistic enthusiasm for life and literature and storytelling. He loved it.
He's like a character that shows up in the 1700s but belongs to the Romantic era.
Well, you see, I think people don't understand how much romance was in the 18th century in some cases. I think
Yeah.
that we can forget that there was a lot of that. There's some wonderfully, again,
Great point.
colorful characters. I love the trio. I love writing them together. In fact,
Yeah.
like Burgoyne, Fraser, and Phillips, these
Yeah.
wonderfully colorful, almost knight errant like
Yeah.
characters.
We'll talk about Fraser in a minute.
Sure. Yeah, so Burgoyne,
So
yeah, it was just writing him was just very fun for me because of how colorful he was, and because he had, I think the thing, as you touched upon with the whole, you said veneer of gentleman and having complications. Well, I would say actually he was in certain aspects when he was a gentleman, he was a real gentleman.
yeah,
Like
sincere.
he was sincere. He'd be very generous to people. He was very good to his friends. He truly loved his wife Charlotte in spite of having terrible impulse control around other women. But it was like, I mean,
That's a way of putting it.
it is, yeah, and I mean that's the best way I can describe it because I mean he went into severe, severe depression at her death.
Yeah.
And he clearly loved her. He clearly did. She was the love of his life. Nobody was going to replace Charlotte to
Well,
him.
I've noticed that and I think we've had some conversations about this, but I've noticed as I've read more about this period that there is like an American lens that we want to read the British military leadership through,
Mhm.
where they're they have like a superior force in a technical sense, but uh they kind of like screw themselves up by their pomposity and their refusal to understand like the
So
American way.
true.
Yeah, so you see this applied to not only Burgoyne, but we've talked about this Edward Braddock as well. Kind of
Mm.
like, oh, this idiot guy marching through the, then Braddock's disaster in 755, or Cornwallis as well. I got a more nuanced view of Cornwallis when I was writing my history of Ireland, and
Mhm.
he was deeply involved in some of the troubles and the risings in Ireland after the American Revolution,
Mhm.
and kind of saw him as a much more interesting. For in most of American history, he's just the boob who got trapped on Yorktown Peninsula by
Yeah.
Washington. And I mean, we don't have to address all these people. We don't have time to, but I'm saying that I
Cornwallis will
appreciate
be
that
getting.
your British characters are much more well-rounded and real people. Maybe not the way we've got them through American kind of stereotypes.
Well, I think the thing, just for record, Cornwallis will be making a cameo in book 3, and
Woo!
Braddock gets multiple references of people flashing back to him, throughout
Yeah.
the series. So we kind of touch on those figures. But
Well,
yeah,
like
I
the way the
totally
British are
agree.
portrayed in the Mel Gibson Patriot movie, like, I mean, that's like
Oh, we could
what's,
do a whole episode on that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um,
Disaster.
so I just commend you for handling it well.
Thank
Um,
you.
eh,
I appreciate. And I agree with you. Like, I really do agree with everything you just said. There is this tendency to again truncate the characters down to their flaws, and then even taking their flaws and blowing them out of proportion. And when I always thought in my head when I was doing Johnny, and more so the more I did, was that, you know what? People love to make him the example of someone we can all look at who's not us and be
Yeah.
like, look at this idiot, look at this arrogant idiot. And I'm just like, I know in my own self, my personality type.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest, could have been him in a minute, like in terms of some of those mistakes he
Yeah.
made. Where
Right.
you're into a project. I've been there before. Not that project, thank heavens, but I've been in projects where you pour yourself into it. You've thought up the idea. You're thinking about it. You have this ideal. It's great in your head.
Yeah.
And then you want to make this thing come to life, come to reality, come to fruition. And you have this great notion. I really do think Johnny viewed himself as sort of a knightly figure. He was, in reality, by the way, a fan of Richard the Lionheart. That's a true thing I
Oh,
threw
that's
in.
epic.
And he wrote adapted French romances about him and turned it into play format, which is awesome,
That's
and
cool.
French plays. So I'm just like, man after my own heart. And so he really had this thing where he had these sort of grand ideas, and it wasn't all merely arrogance. Yes, he could totally be arrogant. Yes, he could be an egomaniac at times, but at the same time, it was more than that. There was more going on than just that reduction of him. That he wanted it to work out for everybody badly,
Yeah.
and he cared
Yeah.
about people. That was the sad part too. He actually was the soldier's friend. Even his enemies called him humane and tender to
Yeah.
them. I mean, he cared about the people under him and with him and working with him. He was a good, like they said, staff leader. His
Yeah.
staff adored him. His team of the trio were very close. They were actually friends.
It's
So there was,
interesting that we don't have too much time to go into Fraser, unfortunately, but you also have Simon Fraser of Balnain. Is that how you say it?
yes,
Um,
Balmain.
Balnain, who is the Highlander general, and it's very interesting because you think stereotypically, you think of the Englishman as more reserved and mannered, and then the Scotsman as more kind of wild,
Hmm.
and it's kind of like the opposite in the book. Like Fraser is like he comes across as like I don't know their age difference, but like he
They're
comes
only a
across
few years different. So
yeah,
so Fraser is like,
he's like the more stolid, like reserved. I mean, he can joke around with Burgoyne, but he's kind of like more on the level I got. And
hmm
I thought that was such an interesting character because normally it's portrayed the other way. Normally it's the Englishman who's like,
hmm
and the Scot is the one who's like, oh, I want to get drunk, But anyhow, so I'm encouraging everyone out there to check out the book. It's available in Kindle format and also in paperback. Um, All Ye That Pass By, Gone for a Soldier. There's going to be three.
yes, there will be three. So the
Okay,
other two are going to be Kingdom of Wolves and Blood of the Martyrs.
great, great. And it culminate. There's some good battles in it. I haven't gotten to the end, but you're going to want to read it. It's good. And like I said, I'm saying this sincerely. I check out a lot of like up and coming authors send me their stuff to check out, and a lot of times I send it back and say this needs like a lot of revision. Avellina's work reads very clearly. It's very engaging. She does very well, and she's very passionate about this. So, um, before we go, I wanted to ask what I have lots of students who aspire to do what you are doing. They have historical fiction ideas, they have their own writing ideas. Like, is there any advice you'd give to younger people who are, wanting to do this sort of thing and what you think would be helpful for them to hear?
I almost feel like in terms of a sort of storytelling philosophy or what to bring to a story kind of thing.
Just anything you found helpful as a
Okay.
writer to find your voice in this way.
Um, so in a funny kind of way, I'm going to actually paraphrase a quote I paraphrased from Burgoyne in the story,
Okay.
which is that he once said that, art, playwriting has to be in touch with nature, sense, and truth,
Yeah.
which is an interesting triumvirate of sort of the, goodness, truth, and beauty kind of thing. But basically, I agree with him, and I agree with the idea that good stories need to be in touch with, I think, reality on some deeper level.
Yeah.
Even lightest fare, which was something that Burgoyne added as a caveat because he wrote a lot of romantic comedies. Um,
Yeah.
but but he said even the lightest fare needs to have that, needs to be in touch with something deeper, needs to be in touch with something meaningful that reflects our reality, that makes us actually, um, I would say, come away with a deeper sense of the actual human experience that we live.
Right. Right.
Something that actually has a deeper, and to do that, I mean, I would advise, I think, being present, with other people. Learn about people.
Yeah.
And be that way when you're reading historical characters or researching historical characters.
And those of you listening to this who are my students or young writers, this is what makes her story work. Is when I read the dialogue and the characters and the action, they all jump off the page as real, well-rounded, fleshed out people. I understand their motivations. I understand where they're coming from. Avellina clearly knows a lot about human nature and what drives people, and she studied her historical characters very well, and they feel real. And what you want when you read any story is you want to enter into that suspension of disbelief where you kind of forget that you're reading somebody else's story and you just kind of get carried into it. um
Yeah, and that is, I mean, I fully agree. And I mean, just touching very briefly on what you'd said earlier
yeah,
about even getting past stereotypes. So you'd mentioned the thing about how you usually have the Englishman being the lace one and the Scotsman being kind of the stereotype of,
yeah,
kind of all over the place emotionally, or drinking or whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, and for me, why I went in the direction I went in was I tried to learn as much about the characters and to
Hmm.
also like the actual characters who were, and of course Johnny is the one, he's the outgoing one, and that Fraser is a little more um the adult in the room or reserved, and that was
Yeah.
not completely reserved, but that was still more his nature as they balance each other off.
Yeah.
But without that kind of, I think, attention to the way characters are, as opposed to simply trying to push certain stereotypes that we get from, well, Hollywood or elsewhere or
Right.
paperbacks, we
Right.
would lose that sense of reality that there are people with specific traits that are personal to them, not merely a manifestation of a stereotype we have connected to nationhood or something. It's
Right.
more specific. Oh, and to answer the earlier question as well. So Burgoyne at this point in the story is around 52, 53.
Yeah.
And Fraser is around 47, 48.
Yeah.
Sometimes the
Okay.
dates get, about the dates of the calendars in this time where everything kind of shifted weirdly and you get sometimes double dates.
Yeah. Yeah.
For
Yeah.
things that are weird to, but yes, they were close in age, but yeah, it definitely is funny how Fraser is actually technically younger a little bit, but he's the one who does come off in the story definitely the more the
Yeah.
adult in the room.
Well, it's good, and we'll have to wrap up with this, but
Sure.
you successfully there's themes of like religion and belief. There's themes of like class issues, nationality, kind of like personal honor, virtue sort of things.
Mhm.
It's like they're all woven together in the human experience, and you express that very well. So, we're gonna wrap this up with one of your friends made a trailer for the book, and I'm gonna go ahead and play the trailer, and we'll wrap it up with that.
Yes.
And I will
Many
leave in
thanks
the
to Leah Fisher.
comments.
Yes,
What's
many
up?
thanks to I just want to say many thanks to Leah Fisher for putting it together for me. She did really a nice job on it. I mean, I'm very impressed by the amount of work she put into making it very engaging as a trailer. And just a very brief pitch to her because she's also a historical fiction writer. So she is actually working on a series at this point, which is retelling the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Oh,
So
dude,
that's
that's
going to
cool.
become, yeah, so that's going to be coming out on the horizon. So yeah, I
Awesome.
would highly advise checking her stuff out as well.
I'll put a link down there too for her. So so yes, thank you. Check out this trailer, and the link for the book and everything will be down below. Avelina, thanks for chatting with me tonight.
Thank you so much, Philip. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. So thank you.
All right, enjoy the trailer, everyone.